Okay, so the Wi-Fi is down here, and I'm hoping my recording system, which puts the recordings immediately on a cloud, is still not losing my recordings. That's always tricky to make sure. So here I'm recording anyways, so let me go back to the PowerPoint and bring it up and get the pointer up to say we are continuing now in governing and governmentalization. The second part is, remember, I'm just taking bits and pieces of the chapter that I find are most useful for continuing with this course. Institutionalization and new institutionalism. Governmentality perspective just introduced suggests that regimes of practices are neither static nor predetermined but contingent and historically constituted. Obviously, history of a country or a state can make a huge difference. When we do the sustaining the commons, we talk about attributes of communities that determine outcomes, and governmentalization and governance and institutionalization, institutions and institutionalism all are part of you know being affected by attributes of people and participants and communities. Whilst Foucault's analysis can be criticized for detaching governmentality from any particular institutional configuration, the governmentality perspective developed here emphasizes the importance of actors in institutionalizing practices. We do the same with Eleanor Ostrom's work, where the entire institutional analysis and development depends on defining how people have repetitive interactions, and how that depends on rules, norms, and how people determine rules, norms, again, through governments, elections, and so on. Institutionalization is the process through which a practice becomes a convention, expectation, or even taken for granted amongst certain actors in specific situations. So we talk a lot about action arena and action situations and participants in the section on sustaining the commons, so that's the common language here. It's best understood as a dynamic, continuous process. To emphasize the role of actors in it, I draw on New Institutionalism, another influential school of thought by Scott 2014 that has been suggested as important for the study of human-environment interactions. Okay. New institutionalism grew out of a sociological critique of early influential organizational theorists such as Taylor and Weber from the early 1900, 1919, and Weber from 1978. So their notion of organizations as closed, self-sufficient instruments for rational, goal-oriented action is what is called New Institutionalism. It built on another strand of critique which showed that organizations are partly structured by external factors and adapt to environmental change actively, strategically, and in a goal-oriented manner. So in sustaining the commons, sorry to keep going back to that, also we talk about how biophysical conditions such as environmental parameters and external factors depending on the action arena. For example, if you're in a classroom, it's in the university setting, there is a professor, you are a student, and there is rules and regulations about attendance, syllabus, grading, evaluation, and so on and so forth. So all those are institutional frameworks. Early new institutionalists then effectively debunked the myth that organizations are structured and functioning only for rational, goal-oriented efficiency. Regardless of how common such ideas are in society, new institutionalism demonstrates that organizations are also structured by institutional rules, and how the rules are decided. And when we say implicit rules, typically they are called norms. We internalize the norms. So if you go to India and you are shopping in a bazaar, then there is the idea of bargaining, haggling, which is not common everywhere else. So these are kind of implicit rules as well. Okay. these institutional rules can be regulative, example given here, legislation and policy, normative, so I just mentioned norms and expectations, or cultural cognitives, for example schema or frames. So when you go to different countries, the way you approach people, the way you ask for things, even when you're buying things and so on, are all cultural cognitive implicit norms. Scholars place different weights on the importance of each of these elements, but they are most often combined in various ways, so it's not one or the other. When all three align, their combined force is most formidable, so you can go and see what that means, regardless of whether the resulting regime of practices is efficient or not. So cultural practices can be inefficient. For example, haggling. Is this really efficient? The vendor will quote a price knowing you're going to haggle, so they're going to put a very high price. You keep haggling and you feel better when you get a good price, but the vendor is making a profit, so he or she knows better what is their range of price change, right? So types of institutional elements, then you have regulative, normative and cultural cognitive, as we just said. So instead of looking for an explanation based solely on a few micro level conditions and events, Van de Ven and Geroud 1994 suggests paying attention to the many micro level events in which actors who are faced with a new situation co-invent ways to deal with it. In the Elinor Ostrom institutional framework, this is action arena and action situation with participants. You can think of again as a classroom or office. In the office you have a boss and you are the employee, let's say, but you may go with the boss to play squash, in which case you are competitors, so you have very new situation and you have to invent or know the explicit ways in which you are dealing with each other in the office versus in another situation. They argue that after a period of behavioral variation, when actors test and adjust activities as they go along, some patterns of activities are increasingly preferred over the others, so rule-making events, until they dominate and become the conventions, so rule-following events or implicit rules or norms. Consequently, interacting actors co-invent and update practices together with high costs in terms of time, energy, and resources. North refers to this as large setup costs and uses the notion of increasing returns to explain why flawed practices are not addressed. So once you've established a certain framework for repetitive interactions, they get stuck. So they may not necessarily be cost effective or efficient in terms of interactions and outcomes. So even when apparent, we don't really address these inefficiencies which we see here. So you have increasing returns over here, but you have increasing commitments and increasing objectification which interact with each other and affect the increasing returns as well. So institutionalization cannot really avoid these because you are implying a collective action. So you may have individual interaction in some situations like buying and selling, or boss and employee, or squash, two people playing, or you can have team sports, or you have groups of people negotiating something. So you have obviously increasing objectification and increasing commitments as being factors that are working within the institutional framework of rules, regulations, penalties, norms, and so on, to determine the outcomes. So potential outcomes are related to all these things. Okay, so he highlights the importance of incentives and argues that flawed practices persist because further efforts in the same direction continue to be rewarded, whilst the cost of changing to an alternative increase over time. So you may get stuck. Somebody is benefiting, they will keep insisting this is the best way, and it's very difficult to go off and find a way that may be very really much better. But in a collective action, many players with vested interest exist, and that's where sustaining the commons comes in as the collective action, which is what we are doing under climate change activities, right? So the status quo is then maintained due to a combination of three factors, as North points out. First, actors are reluctant to consider alternatives after investing time and energy into learning the current practices, such as learning their effects. So it's not like they are not aware that alternatives exist for better functioning, better outcome, efficiency, and so on, but they feel that the investment made is already high enough that they will just stick with it. Second, the contribution of each actor is facilitated by all actors following the same practices, so coordination effects. So you have a collective action where many participants, as Eleanor Ostrom calls them, are involved. So they all are following some common framework, even though information available, rules apply, boss has different rules and different information than you if you're an employee, but still you have to function as a whole in the office setup and the corporate framework or whatever the framework you are working in. Finally, new actors are motivated to adopt current practices as they appear to be commonly accepted, so adaptive expectations. The resulting path-dependent persistence of even flawed practices is especially widespread in contexts with fuzzy feedback and subjective evaluations. So people's perspectives depend on how they are going to benefit in a situation. Let's say the example of the pasture being looked at by the farmer, the grazer, and the real estate agent is a good example. So this is how governing of most sustainability challenges is affected in terms of being stuck in a rut, even if it's a flawed practice. Okay, so this is the mechanism of institutionalization. Let me read a bit more. Finally, institutionalization can also be driven by the increasing objectification of the regime of practices, what we looked at here, objectification. I hope we are being clear of what we mean. Objectifying something often has a negative connotation, like women being objectified, as sex objects and so on. So that's not what we mean here, I suspect. So I should have made that clear. Sorry about that. Such objectification here, more explanation, is associated with the notions of this is how it is done, which is a typical indicator of more cultural cognitive elements of institutionalization. So being objective means everybody is agreeing on this, and it's not subjective based on some people's or one person's opinion. So in that sense, you say this is the practiced thing and this is how it is done, so it is now objective. Here the underlying mechanism relates not to incentives or identity, but to the objectification of shared ideas. Objectification involves the development and diffusion of a certain degree of consensus amongst actors concerning the meaning and value of an idea, where the diffusion shifts from imitation to routinization. So you codify the process, whether it's flawed and ineffective or not. Although the underlying mechanism is separate, such objectification is often linked to an increasingly normative base that leaves less and less room for alternatives. These shared ideas thus thicken and harden when diffused, not only amongst newly included actors, but also for those already subscribing to the particular understanding. So if you're a newcomer, then you see that life works smoothly if you just follow the process instead of objecting or saying it's not efficient and can be made more efficient and so on. So you may have a individual motive, personal motive, self-interest to say I'm not going to worry about efficacy, efficiency, cost and so on, and just follow the crowd, right? So we'll come back and read a bit more. So let me read Foucault's governmentalization and the state and then continue, even though this is actually continuation of the previous part. Let's leave it here. Okay, so see you in the next podcast, because I want to make sure that I'm not losing my recording because of these Wi-Fi issues. See you in the next podcast.